All right. So Dr. Wyatt yesterday was, he's a trained minister, right? So our next speaker to me is kind of like the minister of data, the minister of information, and in so many ways, the organization is all about the cultivating of individual development and growth. Some of you, by the way, and I should point this out because I'm dying to point it out, sat in a Gallup session yesterday. How many people were in that leadership session? A lot. I mean, it was a packed room. The person who ran that session is an old friend of mine, Darlene Mosley. She's sitting right here. She's a rock star. If you were in that session, just give Darlene a big hand for a second. But our next speaker is the executive director of both education and workforce development at Gallup. And some of you may be surprised as he goes through his remarks how much Gallup does. You all know him in terms of polling and public information. But how much they do and how much they do with school systems around the growth of educators and the growth of students. And so when we looked for that spark this morning around prove and information and how to get better in the use of information, there was really only one person that we could turn to, and that is Brandon Busteed. So can we get a big hand for Brandon?
I don't know how to start between Jay-Z and the energy this guy has. But I am very excited to see this awesome runway. I always love to walk, and I was thinking I should have learned how to do a round-off back handspring because this is kind of the perfect runway that could have pulled that off. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to go through a bit of a whirlwind of research that we've been doing over, let's just say, the last 3 or 4 years. We've done some intensive research across K-12, higher education, linkages or lack thereof between education and workplace outcomes. And there's a couple key themes in this data, but also a couple important questions that I think we all need to continually ask ourselves. And so, the title of my talk here is we are what we measure, right? This is an expression that we use all the time. We are what we measure. And I think it's a really important concept to think about, not just in education today, right? But across all the different industries and ways that we think about measurement, businesses, right? Politics, right? We've been exposed to some pretty unprecedented events relative to data. And so here's a statement I'm going to make. And I think this is true not just education, but across the board. Our current data doesn't fully explain our current condition. Our current data doesn't fully explain our current condition. And so let me just give you a couple examples, right? Most of you probably know this, but this past year, was the highest high school graduation rate in U.S. history, 83.2%. I'm glad you applauded for that, right? Because one of the questions I have is why we aren't really celebrating that as a country right now. I listened to Alma Powell, Colin Powell's wife, give a talk at an America's Promise meeting, right? America's Promise has been all about high school graduation attainment. And she mentioned this, right? All-time high school graduation rate. And it was like mild applause in a room full of just absolute fans of that, right? And so one question is, why as a country aren't we really out there celebrating that right now? By all means, it's a very important metric, but see, here's what's also true at the same exact time. These are both true, 83.2% all-time high, and it's also an all-time high for enrollment in remedial courses in higher education. Now, I say that because that takes a little excitement out of our celebration of 83.2%. It shouldn't take a lot out. Believe me, I'm here saying that that's a very important metric and a very important accomplishment. But now you go, well, but why are we at an all-time high of remedial course enrollment in higher education? And here's another one, right? People have been talking about this, but enrollment in higher education has been going down every year since 2010. I mean, we know that, right? It's been going down every year since 2010. We have about 1.5 million fewer students enrolled in college today than we did in 2010. We can't let that kind of trend continue. It's been hit hardest in community colleges and in the for-profit college and university sector. And you can understand some of the changes that have taken place in the for-profit sector, right? But why should community college enrollment be down? I mean, these are interesting things to wrestle with. So all three of those things are true at the same time. All-time high high school graduation rate, all-time high of remedial enrollment in college, and enrollment in college has been going down every year since 2010. Now here's another one. I'm just going to briefly touch on this, right? The latest labor data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 4.7% unemployment. I'm just going to ask you all a question right now. Does it feel like 4.7% unemployment in the United States today? I got one yes. Quite a few no's. The data is accurate. The way we keep track of labor, we've essentially been keeping score the same way since 1940. But here's what's missed by that 4.7% unemployment. That 94% of the 10 million jobs created from 2005 through 2015 are part-time and temporary jobs. Okay, now for some people, that's a good thing. They wanted a part-time or temporary job. They're cobbling together a couple different consulting gigs. That's actually what they prefer. For a lot of people, that is a potential disaster. Here's the other thing that data misses, that we estimate as many as 25 million people in the United States have fallen out of the middle class. Okay, so they're still working full-time, but see, let's just use a simple example. They were making $80,000 a year in Detroit in a high-tech manufacturing job that went away. And now, out of pure necessity, right, they've taken a job making $40,000 a year, probably doing something they weren't trained for, probably something, right, where in that role, they're working as many hours as they were before, but they've probably lost some of their pride, right? But you see the catastrophic downshift that is to go from $80,000 to $40,000? That's a catastrophic downshift for an individual or family. Here's my simple point. We need to continue to track these critical metrics like high school graduation rate, college going rates, right? 4.7% unemployment, the way we calculate it. Those are absolutely critical measures for us to understand. But if we miss some of these other things, you're missing the full picture. And as leaders and as people working to try and solve some of these issues, we have to get the premise right. Because if we don't get the premise right, we can actually make things worse. So here's the first question I think we all need to ask ourselves. What really is our definition of success in education? Because for some students and parents, right, they would stop and say, well, you know, their life's kind of over if they don't have good grades and they didn't get a good score on a test. And those are really critical indicators, right? Those are things that lead you into college and, you know, help buoy you into a good job, right? Depending on the kind of college you get into, all that stuff, right? We know this. But see, when you ask people what the ultimate outcome of an education is, they quickly give you a much more expansive definition. I mean, just think about how you would answer that right now. What would you say is the ultimate outcome of an education? We quickly jump beyond graduation rates and grades and test scores, right? Those are important flags that we want to knock over on the way to a more ultimate outcome. That ultimate outcome, if I just kind of simplify what's a more complex set of answers that people give, it's to get a great job and have a great life. I mean, it's an aim beyond those education metrics that we focus on all the time. And Gallup has done a lot of research in this area, right? But let's just step back and look at how we rate colleges and universities today. This is just a good example. So all these metrics that we use in education are absolutely critical right now. But if that's all we track, we miss the bigger picture. So here's a simple example. College ratings and rankings are largely built off of input measures, right? We take the incoming grades from high school. We take their test scores that they had in high school. We use things like endowment sizes and a whole bunch of other metrics that have no correlation with education quality. We put it in a formula, and we say, here's the best colleges and universities in the country. We've largely judged them by their inputs. This would be like Consumer Reports, taking the raw ingredients of a car and judging how well that car performs by its raw ingredients, and never actually testing it. That's not what Consumer Reports does. People get in the cars, they drive them around, and they rate the cars. So if we're using input measures to judge outcomes or outputs, that's a bit of a problem and a challenge. Here's an interesting one. If we wanted to know the learning growth and development, if we wanted to rate colleges and universities based on the learning growth and development of students from when they matriculate to when they graduate, I'd argue that'd be a pretty fine measure of the best colleges and universities. Where were they when they started, and how far did they progress in their growth? We have no idea, based on that measure, what the best colleges and universities in the United States are. No clue. Because no one is systematically measuring that. Now, you might also do something like measure the outcomes of graduates, right? How does our product fare in the long run, right? In terms of achieving a great job or a great life or whatever other metrics we want to put into there, right? Engaged citizenry. We can go on with this. But we have no measure of that either. Because the honest answer is that almost all colleges and universities, again, from a systematic basis, have never measured the outcomes of their graduates. So there's research that Gallup has done over the years. Oh, by the way, just one other thing I want to say. Higher education, right? Average GPA in higher education has gone up 1.1 points in the last 30 years. So if you graduated 30 years ago with a 2.3, I have fantastic news for you today. Just add 1.1 to that, and you've got a 3.4. There's at least... Amen, brother. Now I know how old Kevin is and what his grades were in college. Thank you for being my guinea pig for that one. But think about this. One of the precious metrics that we use to judge the success of teachers and students and institutions, we've almost outgamed it. Because there's no other way to say it. Higher education GPA is suffering from rampant grade point inflation over the last 30 years, and it's actually more pronounced in the most elite institutions. So as an employer hiring somebody with a 3.4, how do I make a judgment about that? It's challenging to do. By the way, it's perfectly average. Did you know the average letter grade in college today is an A? I can't make this up. It's true. The average letter grade in college is an A. So here's my point about this, right? Those are important metrics, but we can't get carried away in assuming that everything rests on them. And if we outgame these precious metrics, right, in the form of something like grade point inflation, they start to lose some of their value. And we can't afford to let that happen. Now, as you think about what people describe as the ultimate outcome of education, they describe things like a great job and a great life and all these things that are embedded in that. These are things that in some form Gallup has been measuring now for decades, right? This is research that started way back in the 1930s with George Gallup. His original research obsession had nothing to do with politics. It was about trying to quantify a life well lived. Those are the words he used, trying to quantify a life well lived. I love that description. He actually wrote a book on it in the late 1930s. And so over decades now, Gallup has been studying what makes for a great life, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. And I'm not going to go into great description of this, but this is stuff you can measure, right? There are questions you can go out and ask people about their lives, right? How they are experiencing and evaluating their lives that matter to all sorts of key performance indicators that we hold dear. So these 5 elements that we've identified in our well-being research, purpose and social and community and financial and physical well-being, they're not just nice things to measure. In fact, these are critical things to measure. Because if you have somebody in your organization who's thriving in all 5 elements of how we measure well-being, they have 1/3 the healthcare cost burden to the organization compared to somebody who's not thriving in any. And I don't need to get everybody thriving in all 5 elements of well-being. That's a really high bar to achieve. But for every shift I can make from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3 elements of well-being, that healthcare cost burden just keeps going down. Now, the reason why I say this is critical is because our national healthcare tab is around $3 trillion right now, which is $1 trillion more than the entire GDP of Russia, if you want to put that into perspective. Some people make an argument we're going bankrupt as a country because of our healthcare tab. So I'm going to ask the audience a simple question. Is well-being a nice to have or a need to have? There's no doubt it's a need to have. But see, we put well-being in a category like we do everything else. What do we call things like well-being? And grit and hope non-cognitive, right? Or soft measures. See, we even assign words to them that make them sound less important, right? Because if it's non-cognitive, it's not, of course, cognitive. I mean, we kind of put them in tiers. And the simple point about this is that they all matter, but we've given almost no time and energy to the, I'm not even going to say the words, we've already, okay? Because I'm putting them in the critical bucket, not the non-cognitive or soft measures. Because see, here's the big point. We can correlate, if you want to use the term soft measures, we can correlate these soft measures to every hard outcome imaginable, including healthcare costs. Now, when it comes to measuring a great job, there's questions that actually measure this, right? You all know there's a difference between a job where you wake up every morning, fired up about what you're doing, connected to the mission and purpose. You have a manager or boss who's, focused on your development, how to help you succeed more, versus a job you kind of hate, you're going through the motions, you've got a horrible boss, because of, right? I mean, can we all just agree those are very different descriptions of a job? Here's the point. You can measure a great job versus just quantifying how many hours you work and what your pay is. Those are different things. Both of them are important measures. But when we measure what it means to be engaged in work, we ask questions like whether you have a chance to do what you're best at each day, whether you have someone who encourages your development, whether you say your opinions at work count. I'm going to give you the worst statistic of the day. I promise it gets a little better from here. Did you know that K-12 teachers in the United States of all professions, are dead last behind coal miners, truck drivers, and everybody else in saying that their opinions at work count? If you want to change America and change the trajectory of our students and their futures, we just start right there. Thank you. You want to improve student engagement? Here's a big news flash. What do you think the biggest predictor of student engagement is? Teacher engagement. How are we not having that conversation in the United States today? It just blows my mind. Here's a great one. Think about your role. If you're any principals, former principals, right? When you have conversations with principals, this is what I encourage them to think about. Their job is to drive teacher and staff engagement in their building. And if they do that, student engagement just shoots through the roof. But do you see how subtle but important that shift is in thinking about their job? We need to figure out how we change that. It's unacceptable to me that teachers are dead last in saying their opinions at work count. And just like well-being, when we measure workplace engagement, and this we've done more research, by the way, this is the largest meta-analysis that's ever been published in academic journals. I mean, this is data you can't argue with. If you're engaged at work, or you have a work unit that's engaged, they're more productive. They're less likely to be sick or absent. They stay longer in the organization. They have fewer safety incidents at work. If we measure this in for-profit organizations, they produce more revenue and profit. How many more hard metrics do you need to draw the linkage between workplace engagement, being engaged, another one of those soft words, and these hard outcomes that we all care a lot about? Now, here's what's so important about my message today. Any of you ever heard of the 70-30 ratio? So if you've read books on, maybe some of you have, behavioral economics, this is going to sound boring. It's not boring, trust me. Coming from the Gallup guy. This is awesome nighttime reading. I mean, you can't even go to bed. So, here's what the 70-30 ratio says, that although we as human beings love to think of ourselves as very rational creatures, right? What do? We take information and we use it to make an informed decision. The reality is that only about 30% of the decisions we make, big, little, doesn't matter, right, are guided by rational information. Only 30%. 70% is guided by emotion. You know what one of the number one reasons is for students in terms of why they selected the college or university they selected? This is like literally number one when you allow for open-ended responses. It just felt right. That's an emotion. That has nothing to do with rational information. Now, 30% of their decision-making wheel might have included, like, I don't know, what what the rating of the program was, or I don't know, the graduation rates, or what the financial aid package was. All right, all those things go into it. But here's the point. Right now, in this world, we're doing a pretty good job measuring the rational side of this equation, right? What I would call classic economic indicators. We're actually doing a pretty darn good job of it. And the classic economic indicators are very important. So I don't want to be misunderstood by this. This is not a case for behavioral economic measures against classic economic measures. This is about both and, okay? But the reality is that the majority of our decisions as human beings are driven by this behavioral economic side of the equation. So if that's the case, we better up our game big time in terms of how we think about, understand, and track these kinds of measures. So let me just give you some quick examples. This is how we would measure, on the left-hand side, classic economic indicators for the health of a nation. What's the most important one that leaders use to judge the health of a nation? GDP, gross domestic product. Really critical indicator. Here's the problem. If you had looked at Egypt and Tunisia in the 5 years before Arab Spring, GDP was going up steadily in both countries. And if that was the indicator you were watching, you would say, things are going just fine in Egypt and Tunisia. But during those same 5 years, Gallup's measures of well-being, how people were evaluating their lives in both countries, was plummeting. Now, sometimes GDP and well-being move together, but in this case, it was literally an X. And well-being was a much stronger predictor of the unrest that took place in those countries than GDP. Now, some of the other metrics that we use, right? Unemployment, I've already talked about that. That's an important measure to understand, but it misses a lot of the qualitative aspects of jobs in America. So we need both of those. And then here's a good one. I love this one, crime rates. It's such a good example. Because see, crime rates can go up or down in New York City by doing a couple things, right? Adding more police to the force, or just saying, hey, we're going to, like for example, I could increase DUI arrests in the state of New York just running 3 consecutive nights of DUI stings on the highways. I mean, is that an indicator that drunk driving has gone up in New York? Or is it an indicator that the enforcement, right? I mean, it could be both, is the thing. So crime rates are important to understand, but this is one of my favorite questions on our world poll. We literally do a poll every year of the entire world, statistically sampling 98% of the world's population ages 15 and up. We ask people whether they feel safe walking alone at night in the city or the area where they live. By the way, only you are the judge of that. Okay, I can't judge that for you, right? You say I don't feel safe, that's a fact, not an opinion. You see the difference, right? These are questions that only a student or only a parent or only a teacher can answer because they're the experts on their lives. No one else is. So see, if you say, I don't feel safe walking alone at night, that's an indication of fear. By the way, there's a lot of people who say that because they're afraid they're going to get beaten by their own police force. But do you see the difference in these kinds of questions and measures? They're both really important to understand. And if you only have one side of this, by the way, if all you were measuring was the behavioral economic side of things, you'd be missing a lot on the other side too, wouldn't you? So here's how we think about our education success ledger, right? We have metrics like grades and test scores and graduation rates on one hand, and we're doing a really good job tracking those things. Now, we could be better users of those things. So this is a conversation I was having with my friends at ACT earlier, right? This is interesting. Americans in general, we just did a big representative study on this last year. Americans in general are slightly negative about testing. Here's the interesting insight, though. If you get under the hood, they're negative really about the use of testing for solely summative purposes. Guess what they're actually fans of testing for? Formative use of assessment. We have to get more nuanced in how we even talk about testing, right? Because there's some tests that are important and necessary for summative measures. But by the way, the tests that people really like are the tests that give them some information about themselves or about their students. So if you just ask, hey, what do you think about tests, right? Americans are slightly negative. But if you get under the hood of this, you start to have a very different and much more nuanced and powerful story. So we're doing a good job tracking these things. We probably need to do a better job in terms of how we use them. But then we think about kind of the behavioral economic measures. Many of you have read Angela Duckworth's work in some form on grit, right? Grit, hope, these are all what I would call behavioral economic measures. They're certainly important to understand. But here's my only point about this. We shouldn't try to outgame those either. Because you could see a world real quick where America gets all crazy about measuring grit and hope and all kinds of other stuff in schools. And guess what? If we start turning that into a hardcore summative testing environment, we lose the value of those metrics. Okay, so as much as I'm a fan of bringing these measurements and this kind of thinking into schools, I'm also setting up a warning very early that we can outgame them if we're not careful. But here's the reality. That right side of the ledger is not being systematically tracked in any way in our country right now. Now, I know there's schools and districts that have signed on to do various forms of, non-cognitive or social emotional measures. I mean, there's a good, solid movement out there. But as a systematic process for how leaders lead and how teachers teach, right, we really haven't embedded this in our DNA in schools. So when you say, hey, what's the success? What's the definition of success according to Americans as it relates to going to college? There's just a clear answer. By the way, people have a lot of reasons for going to college. It's not one. But when you ask them among the reasons why they value or would go to college, the number one response on any group we've ever asked, parents of 5th through 12th graders, freshman students, which is data from the UCLA SERP study, general population of Americans, it's to get a good job. This is why I say this. It's so important because if they graduate, which is a win for your school and for your district or for your college or university, that's a win, and you're really not held accountable to anything after that. You graduated, you got the diploma, but if that doesn't lead to a good job or a better job for that graduate, it's not a win in their book. Now, it's better than not having a diploma, believe me. But the diploma not leading to a good job is something that we need to think about how we hold ourselves accountable to. I'm not saying we should introduce new accountability measures around it necessarily, but we need to think about holding ourselves accountable to that because that's the number one reason why people value higher education in the United States. So here's my second question, right? The first one is, what's our definition of success? Because depending on that, we could feel really great about how we're doing or not so great. The next question is, are they career and life ready? Because that's ultimately what they're all aiming at, and that's ultimately what you all are aiming them at. Is you want to have that story of that student who you helped get into college come back 15, 20 years later and bump into you in the grocery store and go, you changed my life, and look what I'm doing now, and here's my family, and right? I mean, that's the ultimate measure of the work that we do. Here's our current score on this. When we look at the success of young people in the workplace, and this is a representative study, so we have some are high school only graduates, some are college only graduates. We did this huge study on 21st century skills. We found two things that correlate with work success later in life, and they were the two things that are mentioned here. Whether you worked on a long-term project in school that took more than a few classes to complete, and whether you were able to apply what you were learning to solving some sort of real problem. Those two things sound a lot like real work, don't they? And this is not rocket science. I mean, most of us have probably known and understood the importance of these two things for a long time, but look at the percentages of students who hit the mark on those things. I mean, by the way, college graduates versus high school graduates, there's almost no difference in the likelihood that a college graduate says they applied what they were learning to solving a real problem than a high school graduate. Isn't that unbelievable? Now, in terms of real work experience, it's also pretty small percentages. Less than 5% of students in high school are interning for a local organization of any kind. Only 17% say they're working an hour or more in a paid job. So the things that are getting them any look at what work looks like or what real life looks like, very small percentages of students are hitting the mark on these things. And then there's this one, which is near and dear to Gallup's research and anybody who visited Jerlene's session yesterday, because I would tell you there's the two most important questions in the world that you need to strongly agree to. This is true for 4-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and retirees who are 80. Two most important questions in the world. One, whether you have someone who cares about your development. Two, whether you say you have a chance to do what you're best at each day. If you can strongly agree to those two statements, you probably have a phenomenal life. If you don't strongly agree to those two statements, probably don't like your job, probably struggling a little bit. But here's the problem. See, for students, less than 50% of students in our schools today say they have a chance to do what they're best at each day in school. Now, there's some challenges to this, right? You say, well, how do they know what they're best at, right? I mean, part of that is exploring and trying and understanding. But fundamentally, figuring out what you're really good at is about doing and acting. It needs application. It can't just be theoretical. And I have strategic number one. Here's the problem with that. That's just a talent. It's like a muscle. If I don't use that, it atrophies. But if I put it to work every day, there's no limit to what I can do with my talent theme of strategic. Talents are like muscles. If you don't use them, they atrophy. It's about applying these things in a real work situation, in a project-based learning exercise, right? You get the idea. This is about real-life application. The reason why it would be a good goal to get every student to a point where they touch that moment at some point in the school day is because it virtually eliminates disengagement in school. If you say, as a student, that you feel your school is committed to building on the strengths of each student, there's only a 1% chance that you're not engaged in school. It virtually eliminates disengagement. And 86% are engaged in school, nearly 9 out of 10. So it's a pretty good marker for us to understand how we hit. Now, notice the phrasing of this. This wasn't, I do what I'm best at all day long. Very few of us have that opportunity. At some point in the day, you touch that moment where you have a chance to do something you're really good at. Don Clifton, the founder of Strengths, used to always tell the story about the rabbit who went to school. I don't know the story all the way, but it basically goes like this. Rabbit went to school, and the first day of school, they had a race. And Rabbit ran the race and won, and he came home, and his mom asked him, hey, how was school? And Rabbit said, it was amazing. I loved it. We did a race, and I won. And his mom was all excited and proud. And the next day, he went to school, and on day 2, they had a swim test. And Rabbit came home, and Mommy said, Rabbit, how was school today? And he said, it was horrible. I don't ever want to go back. And he cried. Now, here's my point. We're all going to have to run a race, and we're all going to have to take a swim test at some point. We might be good at one and not good at the other. But we need to figure out how we get everybody to a place where they can touch that moment, where they can do that thing that they're really great at, because that just basically is the key to engagement in school and in life. Now, let me segue to higher education. This is a good one, because we're having a big debate about a lot of this, skills gap in America, so on and so forth. This stat, I think, just tells you all you need to know. We have a very big misunderstanding. Part of this is probably perception, and part of it's reality. 98% of provosts of colleges and universities say they're doing a good job preparing students for success in the workplace. Actually, we just redid this survey 2 weeks ago. I have to update the data for you. It's now 99%. I can't make this up. It is literally 99. It's been going up, not down. Despite everything you read in the news about college graduates aren't, right? I mean, it's like, okay, so provosts feeling really good. Now you say, what about the American population? Not so much. 13% strongly agree. And then you say, well, what does the American general population know about this? They're not experts on workforce development and readiness, right? Well, then you say, okay, how about C-level business executives? And it actually gets a little worse. 11% strongly agree that graduates have the skills necessary to fill the jobs they're looking to fill. 11%. Now, like I said, I don't know how much of this is perception versus reality. Let's just say it's a big, potent mix of both. This is not a gap in the data. This is a gulf. And we need to figure out how to close that gulf. Guess what the number one thing is that employers want from a student? Number one thing, an internship or a job experience. By the way, 85% of employers would rather hire a B student with an internship than an A student without one. Think about that. This is not saying grades aren't important. Absolutely. I have a 5- and a 7-year-old. I'm going to tell them it's important to get good grades, but you better darn well be sure that I'm going to be thinking about how they get engaged in long-term projects and the courses and the schools that they choose, right? What kinds of work experiences they have, paid, unpaid, right? Whatever that might be, those are going to be really critical things that I emphasize to my children. And by the way, here's one of the things that we do as rational decision makers that parents support and the student supports in college. Here's what they do. They pick an easier class because they think getting a good grade is more important, and they avoid the class that requires the long-term project, not because they're lazy, maybe some are, but because they don't want to get a bad grade. And mom and dad, if they're involved, or advisor, academic, whoever it might be, goes, yeah, that's probably a good decision, because if you don't get good grades, you're not going to get that job at Google. The reason why I just mentioned Google is because Google 2 years ago, you probably caught this, announced that they're no longer asking candidates for their grades or test scores because they found no relationship between that and their success in any job at Google. Now listen, that is a canary in the coal mine, okay, and that is not a suggestion that grades and test scores are going away. Not at all. What is an important wake-up call is that we need to understand that there are also another set of metrics that help understand whether somebody is on the path to success or not. And they're not captured by those things alone. So as we think about this, right, work experience becomes a pretty critical thing. Now, we did the largest representative study of college graduates in U.S. history. It's an ongoing study we've been doing for 3 years now. And as it relates to success in the workplace, we found 6 key ingredients that double your odds you end up engaged in your work later in life, and they double your odds you end up thriving in your well-being. These things have very important correlations with success later in life. Go ahead, you can give yourself this quiz. These are statements. 5 is strongly agree, 1 is strongly disagree. Raise your hand if you strongly agree to any of these statements. Here's the first one. I had at least one professor who made me excited about learning. This is thinking about your undergraduate experience, by the way. Pretty good show of hands. 64% of college graduates in the U.S. strongly agree. Now here's a broader one. My professors cared about me as a person. How many of you strongly agree to that? Hey, you're a special group. It's about half of the audience raising their hand. Only 27% of college graduates in the U.S. strongly agree to that one. Isn't that fascinating? Now this is the strongest worded one, but also the most important as odds ratios go. I had a mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams. How many of you strongly agree to that? God, good for you. There's no wonder you're in the work that you're doing right now. See, it's only 2 out of 10 college graduates who strongly agree to that. I mean, almost all the hands in this room went up when I asked that question. Now, collectively, if you strongly agreed to all 3, you're one of 14% of college graduates in the U.S. that strongly agreed to all 3. We're whittling the percentages down pretty quick, aren't we? Now, these next 3 I'm going to share with you are kind of what we call deep learning or experiential questions, a little different than the ones we called emotionally supported that I just read to you. Here's what they are. Sounds similar to one of our other studies. I worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. How many strongly agree? Not bad. See, it's less than a third of college graduates, and this one bothers me more than, I don't know why this one bothers me the most, because I think about it and I go, well, what the heck were they doing all 4 or 5 or 6 years of college? Taking pop quizzes and writing 5-page papers? I mean, yeah. Okay, we need to change that. Yeah. I like the vocal ones, thank you. Now, the next 2 are sorting questions. Let me be real quick. I had a job or an internship where I applied what I was learning in the classroom. That last phrase is the most important because we also asked, did you have a paid job during college, yes or no? And if you said yes to that question, it has no relationship with anything later. I'm not saying that was bad. You made some money, right? You offset your expenses. But the key phrasing here is whether you had a job or an internship where you applied what you were learning in the classroom. Now, collectively, only 2.7% of college graduates strongly agree to all 6 of these questions. The last one, by the way, was a question about extreme involvement in extracurricular activities. Not just were you, but how deeply involved you were. Here's why I end with this. We also asked another question in the study, whether you felt you were well prepared for life outside of college. If you hit the mark on all 6 of those questions I just read, 85% of you strongly agree that you were well prepared for life outside of college. But look on the other end of the scale, and I know it's hard to read for some of you in the back, but a quarter of all college graduates are a 0 on that 6-question scale. A quarter of all, there's no dropouts in this data. 100% of the people in this data set met the academic requirements to receive a diploma from their institution. And the difference and the likelihood that they say they were well prepared for life outside of college ranges from 5% if you hit the mark on none of these to 85% if you hit the mark on all 6. That's a 17x differential on these 6 questions that we're effectively not asking of any student or graduate in America today. The work you all are doing is really important. And your ability to influence what these students feel and know and believe is important for their success, getting them into college is the first major door opening for them. Making sure that they make the most of that experience is as much up to them and what they're told is important as anything else. And so if we can help them understand that a job and an internship and trying to connect that to their studying, and that, by the way, if you can pick a professor instead of the course, because, by the way, all the great professors, they have a reputation for that. There's no secret. They don't list them on the website, but you go around any campus and go, who are the awesome professors here? You get that list. Here's my advice. If you can, pick the professor, not the course. Now, I know you have to hit certain courses to graduate. Okay, I get it. Pick the professor, not the course. Here's my point. You guys have the power to advise students on the ingredients for success in career and life. And I can't think of a group that is going to be able to do a better job than that than the people in this room. Thank you very much for the work you do. It was a pleasure to be with you this morning.